So hello and welcome to this video on the AJH Synth Fixed Filter Bank 914. Let's see what's to come in the video before we get into it. So the Fixed Filter Bank 914, as the panel says, is an inductor-based bandpass filter array. Now, if you've never heard of a filter bank, you can think of it like an isolating EQ. We have an input 1 has a level control, and this feeds the whole circuit. Input 2 feeds the dry side of this wet-dry crossfader that comes from the mix output. More on that later. So with input 1 feeding this filtering, we have a basic kind of soft non-resonant style low pass. And then we have all these bands from 125 Hz up to 5,600 Hz or 5.6 kilohertz, and also a nice soft kind of high pass effect as well. We then have this output section with a left and a right output, mix output, and all out. Now all out is all the bands, all the filters summed together at all times. The mix output has a mix for the dry wet, and input 1 will normal across and feed input 2, and the reason for doing so, and the reason that it has a level control, is that you can do such extreme kind of gain boosts or cuts of the overall level with all this gain control on these filters that you might need to rebalance that dry input level. So by placing your signal into input 1, creating your sound, you can then use the level 2 with nothing in it, with its own little level control to balance the dry-wet blend. You can also get creative and put a different sound into input 2 and fade from the wet, processed input 1 and the different input 2 sound. That's quite fun too. We have a CV for the wet-dry, the WD CV with attenuator. The mix output is also fed by this fader from the left to right bands, again with a mix CV input and attenuator. Now the idea of left and right bands, you may have seen this as odd and even bands on EQ and other fixed filter bank units. It splits these bands from the ones that are a white box with black text or a black box with white text, however you want to look at it. And it allows us to morph between these two bands. It effectively takes the whole frequency spectrum and kind of rips it into two and gives us a stereo image. Finally, we have a feedback circuit, and the feedback knob takes its actual kind of tap of the circuit from the mix output. So even if we're taking left and right out in stereo or the all output, the feedback is fed by the mix out, allowing us to create feedback that morphs between these left and right bands and is affected by this wet-dry blend as well. So it makes this feedback very expressive and very controllable and modulatable as well. So without further ado, let's get into a basic patch just to demo the sound of this. It sounds great. There's a ton of potential tonal sculpting. You can use it in feedback paths over drums, waveforms, however you kind of want to use it. Let's get into some patches and explore. So let's take a look and listen to the Fixed Filter Bank 914. Now my input is a saw wave with a little bit of white noise mixed in, and you can see this fuzzy kind of saw wave shape. Let me plug that in instead so you can hear it. So that's my input signal. Coming into channel 1, then into my mixer, I've got a level. And input 2 is actually an input to the crossfader on the wet-dry. So if we were to turn that down and come out of the mix output, and this is the one that we're currently listening to, kind of works like a VCA. We can CV this. But the reason why you'd want a separate input is because of the huge difference in level that you can get, either boosting so many of these bands or cutting out so many frequencies from your input. You may need to rebalance that dry sound to get a nice even crossfade. So by default, input 1 splits to input 2. Input 2 never goes into the filtering, and we could just set its level and just get a level that works for us. Now on this mix output, we also have an output mix that blends between these left and right bands, or odd and even bands, and we can see on the graphics that they're split up between a little white rectangle with negative space as the text, or just simply white text on the black panel. And again, we can CV between that with an attenuator like we can the wet dry. So fully wet, blended between these two bands, we could isolate everything, but we'll start from the left and work towards the right. We have a simple low pass that kind of feeds the circuit. We can isolate all these bands. And completely kill everything. So the high pass is letting in a bit of that noise. So there's a ton of potential shaping. We can get some great formant-like vocal tones. We can drive that input. And we've also got feedback. Which is very interactive with the other controls, making these little resonant peaks. Of course, blending between the left and right sides with that feedback gives us lots of control. Now let's take a quick listen to this in stereo. So these are panned hard left and right in my mixer. And these have no effect, but they do affect this feedback path because the feedback path is tapped from the mix output. So if I was to make this feedback, we effectively get CV feedback by using the wet dry. And we can blend between the left and right sides, feeding the feedback. So there's a lot of interesting tones to be had. Now if we get our oscillator moving, we can carve out some really interesting tones. Especially by using these left and right outputs. Now the all output is the left and the right summed together, unaffected by anything else. The mix output again allows us to blend between the left and right side and the wet and the dry sound. But of course we turn down input 2, there is no dry sound. We could simply use that like a VCA, going from nothing to wet. While doing that, and we're coming out of the mix output still, we can CV this blend between left and right bands. So that's the basic features and some basic sounds. Let's get into some patches. So here I have quite a noisy input with reverb and delay and a lot of effects and sounds mixed together. And I just wanted to use it as a way of showing you the sound and sonic quality of this fixed filter bank. I'm coming out hard left and right, panned hard left and right on my mixer. And let's just have a quick play around. So there's a ton of potential for just kind of raw sonic sculpting. So in this patch, I've got this really nice, glassy, gorgeous, almost like resonant feedback-like tone out of a wavetable oscillator. Now I'm going to mute some of these sounds, bring them in one by one, and also add the modulation. Now, as I said earlier, input 1 feeds the actual input. Input 2 is a normal version of input 1 with level control, allowing you to actually set the level for the dry sound on the crossfader for the mix out, or plug in an entirely different sound to the dry side. So just listening to the mix out, this is mono, have one side and the other, and can of course play with the EQ on that wet side. So I've got two different inputs, and I'm first going to crossfade between them with this wet dry CV. So I'm crossfading between input 2, totally dry. We could even remove it and be fading pretty much to nothing, or crank it right up and have that input louder than the actual input and the sound coming through the filtering. The wet side, we could maybe drive this, is input 1. Now the two outputs are coming out into some effects, the left and right into a left and right input in an effects unit, and left and right back out in stereo. And that's just to create a little bit of stereo image. These aren't affected by any of this crossfading, so we have a fairly static sound into this reverb delay line that I'm using. But blending in the mix out with the left right out, we can create some nice and quite subtle stereo images in this case. Just listening to the mix out again, let's go fully wet. We can blend between the left and right bands, and I'm going to do this with CV control. Just turn it down a little bit. So we're shifting between these different bands, and plugging this back in, we're now also shifting between the dry side, which is actually input 2, and the wet processed side. So over this already animated wavetable with some detune on the wavetable oscillator as well, we've got 2 more layers of animation and a huge range of potential sculpting from the filter bank. Bringing these back in through the effects. With some really nice, slowly moving animated drones. So here we're going to look at shaping noise to make percussion sounds. It's just a quick patch, but again, it just shows the range of potential sculpting and tone control from this thing. Now we're coming out of the mix output. The all out is just coming into the scope just for a bit of eye candy, because why not? And this is basically white noise through a VCA with a random trigger hitting an envelope, giving us this really simple, dry sound. Now going fully wet, got the out mix set in the middle, so I've got the left side and the right side in terms of these either even numbered or odd numbered bands. And there's just a ton of range in this thing. Now with the option to CV things, we could use, say, a sample and hold signal into the mix CV and have this step between the 2 different sides. Another nice thing would be to blend between the dry wet. Now here's the dry. Again, with input 1 normal to input 2, input 2 never feeds the filter, it's actually the dry input for the wet-dry crossfader. Plugging in a CV to wet-dry, you can get these morphing tones. So if we wanted, say, a wet signal that was just quite dull, we can fade over to the dry sound. Of course, we could still be using sample and hold. To move around between those bands as well, with that mix input. So most of us have probably experienced feedback paths and experienced shaping, control, modulation, tonal changes in a feedback path when we think of, say, a typical delay line that has a filter in its feedback path. So that might be something pings the delay line and it just rolls off some top end because there's a low pass filter, each repeat getting duller and darker and more distant. It's a glorious thing, and we're going to play around with the fixed filter bank through a delay's feedback path shortly. But just cranking the feedback up full on this fixed filter bank, which actually feeds the mix output back into itself, is fantastic. It's inspired some performative kind of noise, industrial performative music that I've performed and made music with. That will come out in the future, but I just wanted to show you this patch. The all output is going into some delay and some reverb here. So we're already aiming for ambient drone type stuff, but we can just feed bits back on itself. And see what I mean? It's ace. All this industrial feedback noise stuff going on. Now the stereo path is out into its own stereo reverb. So just pinging off bits of sound around, and that's the kind of stereo, distorted reverb, stereo image effectively. That's all I wanted to do there, and blend it in with the all out. Now the beauty of the feedback path, especially in this configuration, is that the actual line of feedback within the circuit goes from the mix output. So we can affect it by the output mix from the left to right blend. Oh, that's nice. Effectively creating two different tones that we can move between. And we can do that under CV control as well. We can also use the wet-dry blend, and that input 2, as I said earlier in the video, is what actually feeds the dry signal. But because I don't have a dry signal in here, we're simply getting a kind of on-off level control. So let's ping some signals into this. I'm going to send an envelope into the dry wet, which is going to kind of excite the feedback from nothing to full. And we'll send some random signal into the output mix as well. So this is a random pulse triggering an envelope, quickly moving over this wet-dry blend, and an in-time sample and hold moving the mix between both sides. Let's just kill the effects. Speed this up. Again, really good for sample fodder or just kind of random sound design and sound beds. It's always nice to push stuff and kind of see what happens. So here we've got the fixed filter bank in the send and return path, the feedback path on a delay. Here's my totally dry sound. Now I'm coming out of the mix output and I'm on the dry side of the wet dry. So as soon as I turn up this input, that's going to feed the fixed filter bank, and input 2 is actually the input for the dry side of the crossfader. What it allows us to do here is set the dry level. We can push it for more feedback. And then on the wet side, play with these glorious kind of vocal formant-like tails on this delay. We can of course then crossfade this dry wet from a dry feedback loop to a processed one. So let's put a simple LFO in. So I've got two AJH Synth VCOs running a fifth apart, well an octave and a fifth apart, into the VCA mixed together, simple envelope controlling the VCA, and then into the filter bank. The all out is the eye candy on data that's just bouncing around. We're in stereo, hard left and right, and this drum sound is just a super simple backing for us. It's nothing to do with the patch. And I'm just going to jam around and play around with these tones. There is that bit of delay and reverb in the background too. I like having these completely different tones in each side, one with some bass and some weight, and then one all high and fizzy, and we can really drive that input. It's just got such weight and crunch to it. Let's lose the effects in the drums. So here's just another quick tonal exploration with some drums. I'm coming out of the mix output, so because input 2 normals across from input 1, so I can level control the dry, we can listen to the dry. Kick, clap, little FM kind of sound and a simple hi-hat. Let's have a quick play around. So in this final patch, I just wanted to animate a repeating, fading sound. Turning down the CV animation. Here's the dry sound. Some effects in the background, which I can kill. There's a dry sound. Now I'm using an envelope, this green trace on data, to fade across to the wet side coming out of this mix, the processed filter bank sound. And this is in time with a separate envelope that's controlling the output of the filter bank through a VCA. That's how the sound's fading in and out, with the VCA controlling the level. Now this LFO, moving faster than this envelope, is going to kind of wobble between this left and right side through the mix CV in. Effects on again. Now, it's a really basic patch, but I just wanted to end on some animation and give you some ideas of how to maybe get going with envelopes and LFOs to control the shifting between these bands on this mix output. This is great when you're using feedback because the mix out feeds the feedback, so even if you're coming out left and right or from the all out, you can still use these to influence the internal feedback path and control, so that becomes an expressive thing as well. Check out the other AJH synth demo videos linked in the description. Watch out for the next phase video coming soon and some extra patches on processing analog drones, using feedback as a performative musical tool, and lots more videos to come in the future. Support me on patreon.com/DivKid if you like the work that I do. Hit the thumbs up icon, leave a comment, and cheers for watching.